The massive space station grew larger in the view screen as the human ship moved closer to it. Ambassador Kate Morrison stood on the bridge of the U's Valor and watched the huge structure that housed the Galactic Council. The station was bigger than most moons and held representatives from 47 different alien species. Today she would walk into those halls knowing that most of the beings inside wanted to destroy everything humans had built among the stars. Captain Jake Sullivan moved to stand beside her, and his face showed the same worry she felt. 3 days ago, the Council had sent their message to Earth and every human colony. The words were simple, but terrible. Humanity had been accused of attacking peaceful worlds and breaking the laws that kept peace in the galaxy. The Council demanded that all human military ships surrender and that every human world submit to what they called protective custody. Kate knew the truth was very different from what the Council claimed. For months, her intelligence teams had been tracking strange attacks on various worlds. Ships would appear without warning and destroy cities and military bases before disappearing again. The attacks were blamed on humans because witnesses claimed to see human-style ships. But Kate's people had found something important in the wreckage left behind. The weapons used were not human weapons, and the attack patterns were not human tactics. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Parker approached them with a data pad in her hands. Her expression was grim as she handed the device to Kate. The information on the screen made Kate's blood run cold. Lisa had been monitoring alien communications, and what she found was worse than they had feared. Several species were already making plans to divide human space between themselves. They were talking about which worlds they would take and which human technologies they wanted to steal. Jake read over Kate's shoulder and his jaw tightened. He had been a military officer for 20 years and had fought in 3 different wars to protect human colonies from raiders and hostile aliens. The idea that the Council would simply hand over human worlds to other species made him sick. He looked at Kate and saw the same anger in her eyes that he felt in his heart. The Valor moved closer to the docking bay, and Kate could see the massive defensive platforms that surrounded the station. There were more weapons pointed at them than she had ever seen in one place. Hundreds of alien warships floated nearby, and she knew that many more were hidden just out of sight. The Council was making it very clear that humans were not welcome here as equals, but as prisoners about to be judged. Dr. Alex Morgan joined them on the bridge, carrying a case full of evidence that he hoped would save humanity. Alex was a specialist in alien biology, and he had spent weeks studying samples from the attack sites. What he found proved that humans were not responsible for the attacks. The genetic material left behind came from a different species entirely. More importantly, he had been able to identify which species it came from, the Zephyrian Empire held 3 seats on the Council and was one of the most powerful groups in the galaxy. Alex's evidence showed that Zephyrian soldiers had carried out the attacks that were blamed on humans. The question was whether the Council would listen to the truth or if they had already decided to destroy humanity regardless of the facts. Ryan Torres was working at a computer station nearby, and his fingers moved quickly across the controls. As the ship's intelligence analyst, he had been gathering information about the political situation on the Council. What he discovered was disturbing. Many species seemed eager to vote against humanity even before hearing any evidence. Private communications between Council members showed that some had already made deals about which human worlds they would claim. Kate felt the ship shudder slightly as it locked into the docking clamps. In a few minutes, she would have to leave the safety of the human ship and enter the alien station. She knew that once she stepped through that airlock, she might never return to human space. The Council had the power to hold her prisoner, and there was nothing her small diplomatic team could do to stop them. Jake placed a hand on her shoulder and spoke quietly so only she could hear. He reminded her that the human fleet was waiting just outside the system under the command of Admiral Peter Collins. If the Council tried to harm her or her team, the Admiral had orders to come and get them. Kate nodded, but they both knew that. The Admiral's ships were greatly outnumbered by the Council's forces. The docking procedure finished, and the airlock sealed with a soft hiss. Kate straightened her diplomatic uniform and picked up her case of evidence. Behind her stood Lisa and Alex along with two security officers. They were walking into a trap, but they were the only hope humanity had of avoiding a war that could destroy everything they had built among the stars. Kate stepped toward the airlock, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether humanity would continue to exist as a free people or become slaves to alien masters who saw them as nothing more than dangerous animals that needed to be caged. The council chamber was enormous and filled with beings that Kate had only seen in pictures before today. Representatives from dozens of species sat in curved rows that rose high above the central floor where she now stood. The air smelled strange and carried the mixed sense of many different worlds. Some of the aliens looked almost human, while others were so different that Kate could barely understand how they thought or moved. At the highest point of the chamber sat Nexarch Vorthak, who ruled over the council meetings. He was tall and covered in dark scales that gleamed under the bright lights. His eyes were yellow, and when he looked at Kate, she felt like a small animal being watched by a hungry predator. When he spoke, his voice was deep and seemed to echo from everywhere at once. Vorthak began by reading the charges against humanity, and his words painted humans as monsters who attacked innocent worlds without warning. He described cities burning and families dying while human ships escaped into the darkness of space. The evidence he presented seemed to prove everything he said. Video recordings showed human-style ships firing on peaceful colonies and attacking cargo vessels that carried no weapons. Kate listened to every word and felt sick at how convincing the lies sounded. She knew that none of it was true, but the recordings looked real and the witness statements seemed honest. Someone had spent a lot of time and effort to create evidence that would destroy humanity's reputation in the galaxy. The question was, who had the power and skill to create such perfect lies? When Vorthak finished speaking, he gestured for Kate to step forward and present humanity's defense. She walked to the center of the chamber floor and felt the weight of hundreds of alien eyes watching her every move. This was her only chance to save her species, and she knew that most of the beings in this room had already decided that humans were guilty. Kate began by attacking the evidence itself and showing how many of the recordings contained small errors that proved they were fake. Ryan Torres had spent days studying every frame, and he had found tiny mistakes that only a computer expert would notice. The ships in the videos moved in ways that real ships could not, and the weapon effects were slightly wrong compared to actual human weapons. She called Dr. Alex Morgan forward to present his biological evidence, and the chamber grew quiet as he spoke. Alex explained how he had studied samples from the attack sites and found genetic material that did not match any human DNA patterns. More importantly, the DNA came from Zephyrian soldiers, which meant that the Empire had been present at every attack site. The Zephyrian representative was a being called Counselor Thizes, who sat with the other Empire delegates in a special section of the chamber. When Alex finished his presentation, Thizes rose to speak, and his voice was smooth and pleasant. He claimed that the genetic evidence had been planted by humans to hide their crimes, and suggested that Alex had falsified his results to protect his own species. Kate felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She presented more evidence, including communication intercepts that showed Zephyrian military units moving toward the attacked worlds just before each incident occurred. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence and proved that the Empire had advanced knowledge of when and where the attacks would happen. Thizes responded by producing what he called final proof of human guilt. He played recordings that seemed to show human military commanders giving orders to attack innocent worlds. The voices sounded real and the military codes were accurate. Kate recognized some of the officers whose voices were on the recordings and knew that they would never give such orders. She tried to explain that the recordings were sophisticated, fakes created using computer technology, but many council members seemed to believe Thizes instead of her. The Zephyrian counselor was skilled at making his lies sound like truth while making Kate's facts sound like desperate fabrications from a guilty species. As the presentations continued, Kate realized that the council had no interest in finding the truth. Many of the species had already made private deals about dividing human space, and they needed humans to be found guilty to justify taking human worlds. The trial was nothing more than a show to make their theft look legal. Only a few voices spoke in humanity's defense, and Kate was surprised by some of them. The Altarian delegate stood to say that humans had always been peaceful neighbors and had helped her people during a food crisis 2 years earlier. The scholarly Keplers agreed that the evidence against humans seemed suspicious and called for more investigation. Most shocking was when the Thrakari war leader rose to speak. His people were famous fighters who respected strength above all else, and Kate had expected them to support the council's decision. Instead, war leader Kethrix declared that humans had shown honor in battle and did not deserve to be judged based on false evidence created by cowards who hid behind lies. But these few voices were drowned out by the many species who demanded swift punishment for humanity's crimes. Speaker after speaker rose to condemn humans and call for immediate action to protect the galaxy from further human aggression. Kate could see that most of the council members were not interested in justice, but in the opportunity to claim human worlds and technology for themselves. Vorthak called for order and announced that the council would vote immediately on humanity's fate. Kate tried to object and ask for more time to present additional evidence, but the Nexarch ignored her protests. She watched in growing horror as the vote began, and species after species declared humans guilty of the crimes they had been accused of committing. When the final vote was counted, the result was overwhelming. Humanity was found guilty and would lose all rights to their worlds and colonies. Human military forces would surrender immediately, and all humans would be placed under protective custody, which was just another way of saying slavery. Kate stood alone in the center of the great chamber, knowing that she had failed to save her people from a fate that might be worse than death. The vote was final, and the great chamber erupted in sounds that Kate could not understand. Some species made clicking noises, while others released strange smells that filled the air with bitter scents. The few allies that humanity had managed to find looked sad and angry, but they were powerless to change what had happened. Kate felt numb as the reality of the situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. Nexarch Vorthak rose from his high seat, and his yellow eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he announced the council's decision. All human military forces would surrender within 24 hours, and any resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Human colonies would be occupied by council peacekeeping forces, and human leaders would be arrested to prevent them from organizing any opposition to the new order. Kate found her voice and stepped forward to address the council one final time. Her words echoed through the chamber as she spoke about justice and truth, and the dangerous path the council was choosing to walk. She warned them that if they could fabricate evidence to destroy humanity today, then no species would be safe from similar treatment tomorrow. The council's actions were setting a precedent that would come back to haunt every world in the galaxy. Her speech was passionate and honest, but Kate could see that most of the council members were not listening. They were already discussing which human worlds they would claim and how they would divide the technology and resources that humans had developed. To them, humanity was nothing more than a problem that had been solved, and a prize that could now be divided among the victors. When Kate finished speaking, Vorthak ordered security forces to escort her and her team to quarters where they would be held until the human surrender was complete. The guards were tall beings in dark armor who moved with mechanical precision as they surrounded the human delegation. Kate realized that she was now a prisoner and that her mission had failed completely. As the guards led them through the corridors of the massive station, Kate caught sight of other species representatives celebrating their victory. Some were already making calls to their homeworlds to report the good news, while others were meeting in small groups to finalize their plans for claiming human territory. The speed with which they moved showed that these arrangements had been made long before the trial had even begun. Meanwhile, in space outside, the System Admiral Peter Collins received the news through encrypted communications from agents aboard the station. His fleet of 200 ships had been waiting at the edge of the system, hoping for good news, but preparing for the worst. When the message arrived confirming humanity's condemnation, Peter felt his heart sink even as his mind began calculating tactical options. The Council's enforcement fleet was massive and included over 3,000 ships from dozens of different species. Peter's force was outnumbered 15 to 1 and faced enemies with superior technology and firepower. Any direct confrontation would be suicide, but Peter had not spent 30 years in the human military to give up when his people needed him. Most. Captain Nina Rodriguez commanded the UES Defiant, and she was known throughout the fleet for her aggressive tactics and innovative thinking. When Peter called his senior officers together to discuss their options, Nina was the first to speak. She pointed out that while they were outnumbered, they had advantages that their enemies did not expect. Human ships were faster and more maneuverable than most alien vessels, and human crews were trained to think independently rather than follow rigid battle plans. Commander Steve Adams agreed and suggested that they could use hit-and-run tactics to disrupt the Council's operations. Rather than fighting a traditional battle, they could strike at supply lines and communication networks to cause confusion and delay the occupation of human worlds. It would not stop the Council forever, but it might buy enough time for humanity to organize a more effective resistance. Back on Earth, President Diana Foster was preparing to address the human population about the Council's decision. She had been in constant communication with Kate and knew that the trial was a sham designed to justify the theft of human worlds. Diana had spent her entire political career fighting for human rights and independence, and she was not about to surrender now just because some aliens had decided that humans were inconvenient. The presidential address was broadcast to every human world and colony throughout known space. Diana's words were simple and direct as she told her people that humanity would not submit to the Council's unjust judgment. She declared that Earth and all human colonies were withdrawing from the galactic community and would defend themselves against any attempt at occupation. The Council might have superior numbers, but they did not understand the human spirit and the lengths that humans would go to defend their freedom. Citizens across human space responded to the president's call with determination that surprised even their own leaders. Families began stockpiling food and medical supplies, while civilian engineers worked around the clock to convert factories to military production. Retired soldiers returned to active duty, and young people volunteered for service in numbers that overwhelmed recruitment centers. Carlos Martinez was a civilian engineer who had been working on experimental communication technology for the past 5 years. When he heard the president's speech, he realized that his quantum communication network could give humanity a crucial advantage in the coming war. The system would allow instant communication between human forces across the galaxy, which would enable coordination that their enemies could not match. Lisa Parker was still aboard the station with Kate, but she had managed to establish secret communication with human intelligence networks. What she learned was disturbing, but not surprising. The Council's plans for humanity were even worse than they had revealed during the trial. Humans would not just be placed under protective custody, but would be used as slave labor to build weapons and ships for their captors. The information Lisa gathered also revealed something else that gave her hope. Not all species supported the Council's decision, and some were privately expressing doubts about the evidence against humanity. The Thrakari in particular seemed to be reconsidering their position, and there were rumors that they might be willing to provide assistance to human forces. As night fell across the galaxy, the stage was set for a conflict that would determine not just humanity's fate, but the future of galactic civilization itself. The Council believed they had solved the human problem with their vote, but they were about to discover that humans did not surrender easily, and that their greatest mistake had been underestimating the species they were trying to destroy. Admiral Peter Collins stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched as the Council's massive enforcement fleet moved into position around human space. The enemy had divided their forces into 3 groups, with each one targeting a different cluster of human colonies. Peter knew that his smaller fleet could not defend everywhere at once, so he would have to choose his battles carefully and strike where the enemy least expected it. The human ships looked small and fragile compared to the massive alien vessels, but Peter knew that appearances could be deceiving. For the past 10 years, humanity had been secretly developing new technology based on alien designs they had captured or purchased through back channels. The Council thought they knew what human ships could do, but they were about to get a very unpleasant surprise. Captain Nina Rodriguez received her orders and prepared the UES Defiant for combat. Her ship was one of 12 vessels that had been equipped with the new shield generators that Dr. Alex Morgan had helped design. The technology was based on weaknesses that Alex had discovered in Zephyrian defensive systems during his research into the fake attacks. If his theories were correct, then human weapons would be able to penetrate alien shields much more effectively than anyone expected. The first battle took place near the Kepler system, where a council force of 200 ships was moving to occupy 3 human colonies. Peter's plan was simple but dangerous. Rather than meeting the enemy fleet in open space, he would wait until they were committed to the attack, and then strike at their supply ships and command vessels. The goal was not to win a traditional victory, but to cause enough damage to make the Council reconsider their easy conquest. Commander Steve Adams led a squadron of fast attack ships in the opening assault, and his target was the enemy's communication array. Without coordination, the massive alien fleet would become a collection of individual ships that could be picked off one by one. Steve's ships came out of hyperspace directly behind the enemy formation and launched their missiles before most of the alien crews even knew they were under attack. The Council commanders had expected human ships to fight, like the aliens did, with formal battle lines and predictable tactics. Instead, they found themselves facing enemies who appeared and disappeared without warning and who targeted systems that most military planners considered unimportant. When their communication networks went down, the alien fleet began to fall apart. As individual ships struggled to coordinate their actions, Nina's ship led the second wave of attacks, and her target was the enemy fleet's main supply convoy. The Zephyrian ships that escorted the convoy were powerful, but they had never faced weapons designed specifically to exploit their weaknesses. Nina's gunners opened fire and watched in satisfaction as their shots punched through alien shields that should have been impenetrable. The battle raged for 6 hours, and when it was over, the Council fleet was in full retreat. They had lost 30 ships, including 2 command vessels, and their supply train had been completely destroyed. Human losses were much lighter, with only 4 ships damaged and no vessels destroyed. More importantly, the 3 human colonies that had been targeted were still free, and their populations were cheering the victory. News of the battle spread quickly through both human and alien communication networks. On Earth, President Diana Foster held a press conference to announce that humanity's first stand against the Council had been successful. She praised the courage of Admiral Collins and his crews while warning that the war was far from over. The Council would not give up easily and would likely respond with even greater force. Carlos Martinez's quantum communication network proved to be as valuable as he had hoped. Human forces across the galaxy were able to coordinate their actions in real time, which gave them a huge advantage over enemies who still relied on slower traditional communication methods. When Council forces attacked the Tau Ceti colonies, they found human defenders who already knew exactly where, and when the attack would come. The success at Kepler had an unexpected result when war leader Kethrix of the Thrikari contacted Admiral Collins through secret channels. The warrior leader explained that his people respected strength and honor above political convenience. Humanity's refusal to surrender and their victory against superior numbers had impressed the Thrikari leadership. Kethrix offered to provide intelligence about Council fleet movements in exchange for the chance to study human tactical innovations. Dr. Alex Morgan was still a prisoner aboard the station, but he had been monitoring Council communications through equipment that Lisa Parker had smuggled to him. What he discovered was that the Zephyrians were pressuring other species to commit more ships to the war against humanity. Several species were reluctant to get involved in what they saw as an unnecessary conflict, but the Empire was using threats and bribery to force their cooperation. The Council's response to their defeat was swift and brutal. Nexarch Vorthok announced that humanity's resistance proved they were even more dangerous than originally believed. and that stronger measures were needed to protect galactic civilization. The Council voted to authorize the use of planet-killer weapons against any human world that continued to resist occupation. When news of this threat reached Earth, President Foster called an emergency session of the Global Parliament. The representatives debated through the night about whether to continue fighting or to surrender to save human lives. In the end, they voted to keep fighting because they knew that surrender would only lead to slavery and the eventual extinction of human culture. Admiral Collins received new orders to strike at Council shipyards and weapon factories to prevent them from building more planet killers. The missions would be extremely dangerous because the targets were deep inside alien territory and heavily defended. But Peter knew that if the Council succeeded in building enough superweapons, then no human world would be safe. Regardless of how well they defended themselves, the war was entering a new phase, where both sides would have to make difficult choices about how far they were willing to go to achieve victory. The Council had superior numbers and technology, but humanity had something that their enemies lacked. Humans had the determination to keep fighting even when victory seemed impossible, and the creativity to find new ways to hurt their enemies. As Admiral Collins prepared his fleet for the next series of attacks, he thought about the message that President Foster had sent to all human military units. She had reminded them that they were not just fighting for their own lives, but for the right of all species to live free from tyranny and oppression. The Council's actions had shown that they were willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way, and that made this war about more than just human survival. Lucy Harper had been working in intelligence for 15 years, but she had never attempted anything as dangerous as what she was planning now. The mission was to infiltrate the Zephyrian communication networks and find proof that the Empire had orchestrated the attacks that led to humanity's condemnation. Lucy knew that if she was caught, the Zephyrians would do things to her that were worse than death, but the information she might find could save her entire species. The breakthrough came when Ryan Torres discovered a weakness in the Empire's quantum encryption system. The Zephyrians had become overconfident in their technology and had not updated their security protocols in over 50 years. Ryan's computer programs could exploit this weakness, but only if someone could get close enough to one of their major communication hubs to plant the necessary devices. Lucy volunteered for the mission, even though everyone knew it was probably suicide. She would have to infiltrate a heavily guarded Zephyrian military station and plant Ryan's devices without being detected. If everything went perfectly, she would have maybe 10 minutes to download the information before the Zephyrians discovered what she was doing. Getting out alive was considered unlikely by everyone, including Lucy herself. The infiltration took place during a shift change when security would be at its weakest. Lucy's ship approached the station disguised as a supply vessel carrying food and medical supplies. The Zephyrian guards were lazy and overconfident, and they barely scanned the cargo before allowing the ship to dock. Lucy slipped out of the cargo hold wearing a stolen maintenance uniform and began making her way toward the communication center. The station's corridors were filled with alien smells and sounds that made Lucy's skin crawl. Zephyrian soldiers passed her without a second glance because maintenance workers were beneath their notice. Lucy reached the communication center and used Ryan's tools to bypass the security locks. Once inside, she connected his devices to the main data banks and began the download process. The information that flowed through the connection was overwhelming in its scope and detail. The Zephyrians had not only planned the attacks on innocent worlds, but had been planning to frame humanity for months before the first shot was fired. They had studied human ship designs and weapon signatures to create perfect replicas that would fool most investigators. The attacks were just the first step in a larger plan to seize control of the entire Galactic Council. Lucy watched in horror as file after file revealed the Empire's true intentions. They planned to use the crisis they had created to justify taking emergency powers that would let them rule the galaxy without opposition. Other species would be reduced to puppet states while the Zephyrians controlled all trade and military forces. Humanity's destruction was just the beginning of a campaign that would end with every free species in chains. The download finished just as alarms began sounding throughout the station. Lucy had been discovered and Zephyrian soldiers were already moving to surround the communication center. She grabbed the data storage device and ran toward the nearest emergency airlock, knowing that her only chance was to reach the maintenance tunnels that ran through the station's outer hull. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of pursuit as armed soldiers rushed through the corridors trying to cut off her escape routes. Lucy reached the airlock and activated the emergency release that would vent the entire section to space. The Zephyrians would have to put on protective suits before they could follow her, which would give her a few precious minutes to reach her ship. The maintenance tunnels were narrow and cold, and filled with pipes and cables that made movement difficult. Lucy crawled through the darkness, guided only by the faint light from her handheld device. She could hear the Zephyrians entering the tunnels behind her, but their larger size made it harder for them to move quickly through the confined space. Lucy's ship was waiting at the docking bay, with engines already running when she finally emerged from the maintenance section. The pilot did not wait for her to strap in before launching the vessel into space and activating the hyperdrive. Behind them, the Zephyrian station was launching pursuit ships, but they were too late to catch the escaping humans. The information that Lucy had risked her life to obtain was immediately transmitted to human forces throughout the galaxy. Admiral Collins received a complete copy of the Zephyrian files, and he could hardly believe what he was reading. The evidence was so overwhelming that even the most skeptical council members would have to admit that humanity had been framed. Dr. Alan Foster was a communications expert who had been working on ways to broadcast information directly to the populations of alien worlds. The council controlled most official news channels, but Alan had discovered that he could hijack entertainment broadcasts and replace them with human messages. It was illegal and dangerous, but it was the only way to get the truth to ordinary citizens who had no idea what their governments were really doing. Alan's broadcasts began appearing on alien worlds throughout the galaxy, and the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Citizens who had believed that humans were dangerous monsters discovered that their own leaders had been lying to them. The evidence from Lucy's mission was so detailed and convincing that even the most loyal supporters of the Council began to question what they had been told. On the Altarian homeworld, Ambassador Lysandra watched Alan's broadcast with growing anger and disgust. She had always suspected that the evidence against humanity was suspicious, but now she had proof that her people had been manipulated into supporting an unjust war. She immediately called for an emergency session of the Altarian Parliament to discuss withdrawing from the Council's military operations. Similar reactions were occurring on dozens of worlds as alien populations learned the truth about Zephyrian manipulation. Several species began demanding explanations from their representatives, while others started organizing protests against continued participation in the war against humanity. The Empire's carefully constructed alliance was beginning to crack under the weight of revealed truth. Kate Morrison was still a prisoner aboard Nexus Prime, but she was no longer isolated from events outside the station. Lisa Parker had established contact with human agents who were smuggling information and supplies to the diplomatic team. When Kate learned about Lucy's successful mission, she felt hope for the first time since the trial had ended. The political situation on the Council was becoming chaotic as species that had voted to condemn humanity began reconsidering their positions. The Keplers formally requested a new investigation into the evidence, while the Thrakari announced that they were withdrawing their ships from Council operations. Even some of the smaller species that had supported the Empire were beginning to distance themselves from the Zephyrian leadership. Next search. Vorthek tried to maintain order by declaring martial law on the station, but his authority was being challenged by council members who demanded answers about the Zephyrian conspiracy. The evidence was too strong to ignore and too detailed to dismiss as human propaganda. The Empire's plan to use the crisis to seize power was collapsing as their lies were exposed to the entire galaxy. The revelation of Zephyrian treachery changed everything about the war, and humanity found itself with allies it had never expected to have. The fight for survival was becoming a fight for justice and freedom that would determine the future of galactic civilization. The revolution began on the Keplerian homeworld when their parliament voted to formally accuse the Zephyrian Empire of War Crimes and Conspiracy Against Galactic Peace. Within hours, similar declarations were being made by a dozen other species. As the evidence of Empire treachery spread through official channels, the council that had condemned humanity was tearing itself apart as member species chose sides in what was becoming a civil war. Ambassador Kate Morrison found herself at the center of the political storm when moderate council members began seeking her out for secret meetings. Representative Yerix of the Altarians came to her quarters under cover of darkness to discuss forming a coalition of species that opposed Zephyrian control. He explained that many council members had been intimidated into voting against humanity, but now they had the courage to stand up for what was right. Next Search Vorthak tried to maintain his authority by ordering the arrest of any council member who questioned the original vote against humanity. His security forces were loyal to him personally rather than to the council as a whole, but they were outnumbered by the growing opposition. When Vorthak ordered the detention of the Keplerian delegation, a dozen other species threatened to withdraw from the council entirely. The situation became even more complicated when Admiral Collins arrived at Nexus Prime with a fleet of human ships. He had not come as a conqueror, but as a liberator responding to requests for help from council members who were being held prisoner by Vorthak's security forces. The sight of human warships docking at the station sent shockwaves through the Empire. Loyalists who had thought they were safe behind the station's defenses. Captain Helen Burke led a team of human marines through the station corridors to secure the council chambers and protect moderate representatives from Vorthak's thugs. The fighting was brief but intense as Empire security forces tried to maintain control of key areas. Helen's troops were outnumbered, but they had better training and equipment, and they quickly gained the upper hand in the close-quarters combat. The breakthrough came when war leader Kethrix of the Thrakari arrived with a fleet of warrior ships and declared his support for the growing rebellion against Empire control. The Thrakari had always been fierce fighters, but they had also always been honorable, and they could not stomach the idea of supporting a regime built on lies and manipulation. Kethrix's warriors joined the human marines in securing the station. Dr. Alex Morgan was finally released from detention, and he immediately began working with alien scientists to analyze the evidence that Lucy Harper had obtained from the Empire's communication networks. The data was even more damning than anyone had realized, because it showed that the Zephyrians had been planning their takeover for decades. They had manipulated conflicts and crises throughout the galaxy to weaken other species and strengthen their own position. Kate Morrison addressed the reformed council that emerged from the chaos, and her words carried weight that they had not possessed during the original trial. She spoke about the importance of justice and truth and the need to build a galactic community based on cooperation rather than domination. Her speech was broadcast throughout the galaxy, and it inspired millions of beings who had been living under the shadow of Empire tyranny. The evidence against the Zephyrians was so overwhelming that even their former allies began abandoning them. Species that had supported the Empire for years suddenly discovered that they had been manipulated and used as tools in a larger plan that would have eventually destroyed them as well. The Empire's military forces found themselves isolated and outnumbered as their alliance crumbled around them. Carlos Martinez's communication network played a crucial role in coordinating the rebellion as it spread to Zephyrian space itself. Imperial citizens who learned the truth about their governments crimes began organizing resistance movements on dozens of worlds. The empire that had seemed so powerful just weeks before was collapsing from within as its own people turned against their corrupt leaders. The final confrontation took place in the council chambers when Nexarch Vorthak made one last attempt to maintain power by threatening to destroy the station with everyone aboard. He had become desperate and dangerous, and Kate realized that he would rather see the galaxy burn than give up his position. But Vorthak had underestimated the determination of the beings he had tried to control. Councillor Thyses of the Empire tried to rally support for Vorthak, but found that even his own delegation was turning against him. The evidence of Empire crimes was too strong and too detailed for anyone to deny. When Thyses pulled a weapon and tried to shoot Kate, he was stopped by Representative Yerix, who had been waiting for exactly such a moment to act. The revolution ended when Admiral Collins and war leader Kethrix, working together, captured Vorthok and his remaining loyalists. The corrupt Nexurch was placed under arrest along with the entire Zephyrian leadership while the council began the process of forming a new government. Kate found herself nominated to lead the transition as the first Secretary General of what would become the reformed Galactic Assembly. President Diana Foster received the news on Earth, and she addressed the human population with tears of joy in her eyes. Humanity had not only survived the greatest threat in their history, but had helped to free the entire galaxy from tyranny. The war was over, and humans could return to building their civilization among the stars without fear of persecution or destruction. The new galactic government that emerged from the crisis was very different from the old council. Instead of being dominated by powerful species like the Empire, it was based on principles of equality and justice that gave every world a voice in decisions that affected them. Kate worked with representatives from dozens of species to write a constitution that would prevent any single group from gaining too much power. When Kate was offered a permanent position as leader of the new government, she surprised everyone by accepting only a temporary role. She explained that humans had learned the importance of peaceful transitions of power and that no one person or species should hold authority for too long. Her decision impressed the other species and showed them that humanity could be trusted. With power because they were willing to give it up, the galaxy began to heal from the wounds inflicted by years of Empire manipulation and control. Worlds that had been enemies discovered that they had more in common than they had realized. Trade and cultural exchange flourished as species that had been isolated by imperial policy began working together for the first time. Admiral Collins returned to Earth a hero, but he was most proud of the fact that his ships were now working alongside former enemies to help rebuild worlds damaged during the conflict. Human engineering teams worked with alien scientists to develop new technologies that would benefit everyone, while human doctors shared their medical knowledge with species that had been denied proper healthcare under Empire rule. The day that humanity defied the Galactic Council became a turning point, not just for humans but for every free being in the galaxy, and the legacy of that defiance would inspire future generations to never surrender their freedom to those who would rule through fear and lies.